So let's talk about the first new feature in Web API 2 called attribute routing. So here in Visual Studio, if we look at the app start, we're going to remember that there's this Web API config file that we were using to configure our routes. So each of the routes here defined what controller is responsible for what path here. So you're able to take an individual controller and determine that when someone goes to this API Nutrition Foods with a food ID that is optional, that we're going to use the foods controller, and it's going to go ahead and find it for us. This is beneficial because you're defining the route for an entire controller all at once, and this is a pretty powerful construct, but does occasionally cause problems when you have one controller that may be responsible for multiple types of paths, or when you need some specialized constraints and you end up creating lots of routes instead of being able to create exceptions to routes. So in Web API 2, they allow us to use attributes to define the routes directly on the controller. In order to support this, you're going to use a setting on the config called map HTTP attribute routes. And what this is effectively doing is saying, go search all the controllers for these attributes that we're going to use and create routes for them. The way it's creating these routes is a little different, as we'll see in a bit, but let's see what the functionality does first, and then we can talk about how it works under the covers. These new attribute routes actually get in the way of the way we're doing versioning. We're doing versioning with our own controller selector. So for now, we're just going to comment that out. We're going to come back and re-enable this and show you how the routes are actually configured under the covers and re-enable this in a couple of videos. Another change we're going to need to make is we're going to need to reverse the way that this configuration is called. So we look at global ASAX, we're going to see this call to web config register passing in the configuration object. In Web API 2, they've actually reversed this. We're actually going to call global configuration, but we're going to use the method called configure where we pass it the callback. And this callback is simply the call to register inside of our Web API config file. This is simply allowing us to defer when the configuration actually happens. It's going to happen later in the cycle when Web API is ready for it. This is actually a pattern you'll see go forward with some of the other configurations that are happening. We're still calling register to do the configuration. We're just doing it whenever the global configuration is ready. So it allows them to call it later instead of us having to do it on startup. Now that we have that, let's create a new controller, and I'm just going to call this the stats controller. We're going to have just a very simple controller here that returns some stats about the data in the database. And if you viewed the rest of the course, you're going to be pretty familiar with this. We're going to change it to the base API controller that we created. We're going to generate a constructor that takes in our repository, and we're going to pass that repository into the base class, just so all that wire up is going to happen. And for us, we're just going to create a quick get to return some standard data from the database. And I'm just going to paste in some code here. And this is just going to create a new result object that has the number of foods and the number of users. And then we're just going to create a response by passing that back to the user of this API. If we go ahead and build this and look at this new stats API in the browser, we're going to see that it's returning a 404. The reason for that is that we haven't defined a route for the stats controller. Normally what we would do is go back to the Web API config and create one of these sections for the stats controller. In our case, we're not defaulting back to a default route. We're specifying specifically the routes we want to get at, so there's no fallback route for us to actually use for the stats controller. Instead, we're going to be using attributes to define the routes. So here on the get itself, I'm going to use an attribute called route, and this route is going to take the path. And so here I can specifically design the route to this get message, to this very specific call on my controller. So let's build it. And we can see it's now routing directly to that get because we're using this attribute to say, hey, the route for this specific get call is right here in the route. So in a nutshell, this is how the basic route works. We don't define the route in the config file. We instead define the routes directly in the classes as close to the code as possible. Let's see what else is available.